Hello, welcome to Building Applications with ArcGIS Server for the Microsoft .NET Framework. My name is Tom Brenneman. I work for the Professional Services Group here at ESRI, and I'm based out of Noblesville, Indiana. I'm joined today by Brian Baker. He works here in Redlands on the development team for ArcGIS Server. Today we're going to talk about the Web ADF. We'll introduce you to the Web ADF and explain what you can do with it. We will look at some of the web controls that are in the Web ADF, and we'll look at a specific use case, a customization of ArcGIS Server use case of building a custom tool. Today we're going to be talking about building applications with ArcGIS Server. ArcGIS Server is here in our family of products, and its main role is to serve up GIS functionality to a wide array of clients. It can access data from either an RDBMS or from some file-based data source. But we're going to be working right here with ArcGIS Server and building web applications to work mostly here with a web browser. So what is this Web ADF? The Web ADF stands for Web Application Developer Framework. It's two things. It's an SDK for building GIS applications, and it's a runtime for deploying those GIS applications. So with the Web ADF, it comes with a set of components that you could use in Visual Studio for building your web app. And then when you're ready to deploy it, you would deploy the Web ADF with your application. The Web ADF is built on the Microsoft .NET 2.0 framework, and it's very tightly integrated here. So if you're used to working with the .NET framework, working with the Web ADF is really just going to give you a new set of controls and classes that you're going to work with. And in fact, we even use some .NET classes with our classes. One of the great things about the Web ADF is it doesn't just work with ArcGIS Server. Of course, we can access data coming out of ArcGIS Server, but we can also use services coming from ArcIMS or ArcWeb services, or any service on the internet that provides data in a WMS format. That's an OGC format on the internet. So all of these, and in fact you could build your own service type that could plug into the Web ADF. All of these can be used in a single application. So yes, we can use services from ArcGIS Server, but we can also use them from a wide variety of data sources. So now I'm going to go through a couple of examples of different applications that you might use, that you might build, and the parts of the Web ADF that you may focus on with those applications. The first example here is building a web application. So if you were building a web application, you would want to build that in Visual Studio using controls, web controls. Well, the same thing is true here. The Web ADF contains web controls specific to GIS functionality that you can add to your web page in Visual Studio. Another use case might be building a web service. A web service is just kind of like a function that you can call over the internet. And the web service doesn't have a visual interface. It's just for interacting with different web applications. So a web service wouldn't use web controls. Now, another part of the Web ADF is these classes called the Common API. The Common API is a set of classes that perform GIS functionality on all of our different data sources. So all the data sources we talked about on the last page, ArcGIS Server, ArcIMS, etc. So the Common API is just a set of classes for working with those data sources, and I could publish that functionality through a web service. The last example that I have here is an editing service. This editing service is going to work with a specific data source. So it's going to edit maybe SDE data or some file-based data, some specific data source. To do that, you'd have to work directly with the API for that data source. So in that case, you'd work with the data source specific API in the Web ADF. And that'll get you to things like ArcObjects and the ArcIMS.NET API. So you can work at any of these different levels in the Web ADF. And these examples are just giving you an idea of what parts of the Web ADF you might use in these applications. They're not mutually exclusive. So if I was making a web app, I could work with a common API or this data source specific API, depending on the requirements of my application. But these are the main parts of the Web ADF: web controls, the common API, and then data source specific APIs. So with that, let me show you a quick application that we've built that ties together a variety of web services or GIS services. So here I have a map. This is a web application that is a map of the world. Now, one thing that you should notice here, if I look in the table of contents, we have a world service and a Europe service. The world service is coming in from ArcIMS, and we're actually using a WMS connector to ArcIMS. So we have ArcIMS data here, and we also have a Europe service. So let me zoom in here, and I'll show you that. There's our Europe service. So this is ArcGIS server, an ArcGIS server service coming in and being mixed with an ArcIMS service. Let's zoom in here a little bit more and turn off that world service. Now we have some other services that we can take advantage of in this map. These are using ArcWeb services. So these are the services, ArcWeb are the services that ESRI provides, and you can subscribe to these services. In this case, we have a find place, and I'm going to find the Netherlands. Okay, let's find where that is. So right now we're sending a request from this application to ArcWeb services. We get a result set returned, and we have several choices for the Netherlands, but we're looking for the country. So we'll zoom in here a little bit more. There's the Netherlands. Now let's do another request of ArcWeb services. Let's use the European address finder of ArcWeb services, and I have an address here that I can use. This is the address of the ESRI local distributor in the Netherlands. So we'll find that, and we get a result set returned. And there it is. There's our ESRI distributor in the Netherlands. I can zoom in. You can see they're right there in Rotterdam. And I have some other tools that I can work with. Like, what if we wanted to find out if the folks in the ESRI office in the Netherlands wanted to take a swim? How far are they from the river? Well, I could use this measure tool to find that out. Just under a mile. About 1.5 kilometers. Okay, so the important part here is not necessarily to know how far the ESR office in the Netherlands is from the river, but to show you that we're pulling together a wide variety of services from the internet and mixing them together in this application built in the Web ADF. Okay. Now, what would it take to build an application like that in Visual Studio 2005? Well, the first place that you might start is with the web mapping application template. This is a template that we build right into Visual Studio that is a good starting place for a web mapping application. It gives you a lot of controls and layout pre-built. So the other thing that you could do is just add these web controls to your web application. We have a wide variety of web controls that you can work with in Visual Studio. In Visual Studio, we also have some context menus. So we've extended Visual Studio to make it easy to do some of those common tasks that you have to do when you're building a web application, like adding references specific to ESRI assemblies, or adding an ArcGIS identity. If you're used to working with ArcGIS Server, if you're using a local connection, you need to provide a username and password to make that local connection. So we provide this context menu for adding that connection to your application. The last thing, and probably the thing you'll use the most, is the developer help when you're building applications. The developer help contains a wide variety of discussions and topics discussing programming tasks that you might do with the Web ADF. It also contains a great many samples that give you examples of how you might do those particular tasks. There's also component help that's integrated with Visual Studio, so you can get information on objects and properties and methods. And there's the dynamic help. So we're completely integrated with the dynamic help in Visual Studio. So while you're typing the code in Visual Studio, you'll get your dynamic help popping up appropriate for that particular class. Now, when you're ready to build your first web application, there's a couple of options that you have and how you might build it. The first way is to use the ArcGIS Server Manager. ArcGIS Server Manager is a web application that walks you through publishing web services from ArcGIS Server and web applications. So you can use this wizard-driven interface to build your application, and then you might customize it in Visual Studio. One of the benefits of this is ESRI takes care of constructing that layout for you, the layout of your application. The same is true if you're using the Visual Studio template. So in Visual Studio, you'll have this additional option when you install the Web ADF called Web Mapping Application. You click on that when you create a new website, and now you'll get some default pages and a default web application layout with some controls already set up on your page. So the first two ways to create your first web application. Another way is to just create an empty website and add these ArcGIS web controls to that website. So you see here on the right, we have a wide variety of web controls that you can use in your application. You can just add those on and lay out your application however you want. With this method, you get a lot more control over how things are positioned on your web page, but you're going to have to take care of the work of handling the layout yourself. So you're going to have to build the things like the tables and so forth for managing those controls on your web page. The last example here is you could just integrate these web controls in an existing web application. So the point here is that these are web controls like any other web controls that you're used to in ASP.NET, so you can integrate them with existing web applications. Let's talk a little bit more about this web mapping application template and what it gives for you. The first thing that it gives you is a series of web pages. It gives you the main web page that you see an example of here on the right. That web page has a series of controls laid out on it. It also has some error pages and other pages like that it builds for you. It has all these controls like the overview map and the map contents that you see here. It has a site map, and this is just an ASP.NET site map that you're used to in ASP.NET 2.0, and it interacts with a menu control here to give you some commonly used links on your web page. We also use themes in this web mapping application template, and if you look at this example, the header here has an image in the background, and all of our controls have this blue color. That's because they're using a specific theme that has that blue color in it. So you could change all this by simply changing the theme. You could change the background and change all the color scheme by just modifying those themes. And we ship quite a few themes with this template. You have some resources, and these are just your standard HTML resources like the images that you see here for the tools. We have some custom tools like the magnifier window that you see here. You can drag it around like a magnifying glass on your map. And we have a help system. You see right over here on the right of this application, we have a link for the help. That help is help for using this web application. So your users of your application can click here to find out how all these tools and controls work in this system. The nice part about that is it's just HTML pages. You can customize those with whatever additional functionality that you add to this application. So let me give you an example of building a simple application using the template. So here I'm in Visual Studio. I'm going to create a new website. It's a new web mapping application. I'm going to name it World. Okay. When I click OK, what it's doing, you can see a lot of activity here in Visual Studio. It's building all of those pages and adding all of the controls and properties onto those pages. So if we open up default.aspx, there is the markup for the default page. If we look at that in design view, we can see the general layout, and this looks a lot like the application I showed you earlier. We have a toolbar across the top. We have some different controls along the side for interacting with the map, and we have the map right here in the middle. Now, there's also some controls that you don't see in the web application, like this Map Resource Manager. This is a control that's not visible at runtime. And what this does is allow you to access different GIS services on the internet. So I can add resources to my web application through this Map Resource Manager. Here I'm going to click Edit Resources on this smart tag for this control. I'll pop that up. And let's add in a new resource. And this resource is synonymous with GIS service to this application. So this is an ArcGIS server resource. This is the location of my ArcGIS server services, and I can pick the resource that's available on that server. In this case, I want the world service. So I add that in, click OK, click OK. Okay, we've added a new GIS service to our application through this Map Resource Manager. Now let's run this application and see what it looks like. So right now, what's happening is Visual Studio is compiling the project. It's launching the web page, and we're accessing that web service from that service that we referenced in the Map Resource Manager. I can show the map contents here, and I can do things like zoom in on the map. I'll zoom in here, and we can pan around the map. Now, all of this functionality came with that in that template. Something else that you should notice is while I'm panning around this map. Right now, the panning is very smooth, but notice if I pan to a brand new location, do you see the white there? What's happening is the map control on my page, as I pan to a new location, is making a local cache of the map. So it's making this local cache of the map so that as I pan to areas that I've already visited, I get a very smooth panning environment. When I go to a new area, it builds the tiles for that area and then makes a local cache. All of this functionality is built into the map control. I didn't have to do anything to enable that. I just added and pointed to a particular resource, a GIS service on the web. And I have other tools like Identify that I can get more detailed information about particular areas, in this case Italy, and I can show it on my map. Okay. So let's review what we just talked about. The Web ADF is a mechanism or provides the ability to pull together a wide variety of GIS services in your web applications and web services. The Web ADF contains a variety of web controls that you can use to build a web application. It also has a common API that you can use to access all of these different data sources, or you can get down into the data source specific APIs. The Web ADF extends Visual Studio 2005 with a template for building web applications, web controls that you can use for customizing your applications, context menus for common tasks, and developer help. With that, I think I'll turn it over to Brian, who has some questions from you that he's ready to answer. Brian?
Thanks, Tom. Looks like we've got some good questions. We'll try to answer a few now, and we'll answer some more later. First question, let's look at Bill from Tallahassee asks, what version of Visual Studio is used with the ADF? We actually support any version of Visual Studio 2005. So that's the current released version of Visual Studio. And you can use any for any version of that, including the free Visual Web Developer Express version. If you use the free version, you might not get quite as much integration. There's some information on our help site about that. Tom will talk about some of the resources for looking at additional information. But yeah, you can use any version of Visual Studio with the Web ADF. Second question, kind of related question. Donald from Rapid City asks, does Visual Studio have to reside on the same computer as ArcGIS server? The answer is no. You can actually distribute the components to different machines. The core server, the server that creates the maps and handles the data access and those sorts of things, can be on a remote machine. Your local Visual Studio machine, all it really needs is the SDK that Tom mentioned earlier. So you can install that SDK on a number of machines, on several machines in your organization, and developers can be working on that and using the server that's installed elsewhere. Let's look at one more. Eric from Kahului asks, is there a control that gives web users the capability to print the map through the application instead of just using the browser's print command? The answer is right now we don't have a print template or print control. We're working on that sort of thing. So that should be available probably by the next major release of ArcGIS server. For now, you can, like we say, print the browser's page. You could create a dedicated print page that has just the map control and pass the application's extent parameters to that and call it up. We might possibly release a sample that has a custom task that does a print, something like that. We're hoping to have those sorts of things, custom tasks and such, that are available for other users. But for now, those are the options available to you. All right, I think we'll go back to the presentation. So Tom, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Brian. All right, let's look in a little bit more detail at those web controls that you get with the Web ADF. Web controls allow you to rapidly build web applications. They're visual and non-visual components that you can add to your page that perform a certain function for your web application. All of our web controls, by default, use the AJAX capabilities of ASP.NET 2.0. If you're not familiar with AJAX, AJAX stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. And what that basically does for you in your web applications is it allows you to asynchronously communicate with the server so that when you're working with a part of your web page, you can refresh just that part of the web page instead of posting the entire web page back and refreshing the entire page. You may have seen this with other applications. Kind of the way things used to be is that anytime you did an interaction with the page, it refreshed the entire page. Well, now with AJAX capabilities, we don't have to do that. We can just refresh the part of the page that we're working with. That's specifically important when we're working with a map. So you saw when I was panning the map, just the map was refreshing, not the rest of the page. So it lends itself to a much nicer user experience in your web application. The primary control that you'll likely work with is the map control. This is the central control for displaying GIS services in your web application. It allows for all that functionality like continuous panning and keyboard integration And I showed you some of that in the last demonstration where I was panning and zooming around the map, and it was building that cache as I panned around. All of that functionality is built into the map control. The map control gets its resources from the resource manager control. So you saw in that last demonstration, I used that resource, the map resource manager control, to access a service from ArcGIS server. Once I did that, the map control was tied to that resource manager, and it knew what resources to display. I could have added as many resources there as I want, and the map will display whatever resources I add. Resources are generic containers in the Web ADF for GIS services. So those GIS services that you have, when we're working with them in the Web ADF, we put them in these generic containers called resources. The data sources behind those resources are what provide the functionality and implementation for the functionality in that resource. So ArcIMS might provide mapping and geocoding functionality for my resource, maybe a little bit differently than ArcGIS server would, but the end result in the Web ADF is the same. We just work with mapping and geocoding functionality. When you're working on building a web page, you'll aggregate these resources in different manager controls. We have a map resource manager control that I showed you in the last demonstration, but you have other resource managers for your other resource types, like a geocode resource manager for all your geocoding resources, and a geoprocessing resource manager for all your geoprocessing resources. When you're working in your web application, many of these controls work together. For example, we talked about how the map control gets its resources from a resource manager. So we have to tie the map control to a resource manager so it knows where to get its resources from. We do that through the properties on the control. The map will have a property that is the resource manager. So we just set that, and that ties these two together. There's other controls that work the same way. For example, the toolbar control. The toolbar control contains tools that interact with the map. You saw that when I panned and zoomed around the map. Those were examples of tools in the toolbar. We set that same association up through properties on the toolbar. We also have a table of contents control. You saw that in the map contents. That ties to a specific map because we might have multiple maps on our page. And the last example that I have here are tasks. And you saw that in the first example when I used the ArcWeb Services find place and find address. Those were examples of tasks that I might have in my application. Tasks work with a specific resource manager, and they ask a question of that resource. They take that question, in that first example it was an address search. They take the results of that and pass it on to a results control. That results control then ties to the map and allows you to visualize those results in the map. So what are these tasks? Well, they're lightweight controls that you can have in your application that perform some function. They ask a question of a specific resource, and they provide an answer in your task results container. They're very lightweight on the client. There's not a lot to them, just some input for what the user is looking for. In that first example, it was the input of our address that we were searching for. Behind the scenes, the server is doing the heavy lifting of figuring out what the answer is to that question. So the server is really doing all the work behind the scenes. And as you see here, we have quite a few tasks that are pre-built that allow you to ask a wide variety of questions, but of course you could customize that and add additional tasks to this list. When you're working with them in the web application, you add tasks to a task manager. Okay, this task manager control is a lot like our resource managers. It's just a place to collect together all of your tasks, and really all that task manager does is provide some XML that can be consumed by other navigation controls in your web application displayed on your page. For example, here we're showing you 3 tasks that are being displayed in a menu control. This menu control is getting these task names from the task manager control. How do you set one of these tasks up? Well, it's pretty easy. You just drag them from the toolbox onto the task manager control. You tell the task where it's going to display its results. So that's this point, buddy the task or the task results control. And then you configure properties specific for that task. In the next example, I'll show you setting up some query properties for that particular task. You can get to a lot of these most common properties through smart tags. When you hover over the control, you'll get a little pop-up here that'll give you the most commonly used properties for that task. And you can click on those and set those properties. So let me show you, give me an example of working with controls in this web application that we've created here. The first control that I want to show you is one that you don't get in with the ArcGIS Server Manager. It's the Map Tips control. So the Map Tips control will show a little pop-up over points when you hover over them to get more information. Let's click on this link here, and we'll configure the layer that we're going to provide the pop-up for. So we have to give it a resource manager, and then we specify the resource. We only have one resource in this map, so it's pretty easy to choose from. And we're going to choose the largest cities. Okay, we're going to have a little pop-up that comes up over the largest cities. And this pop-up is going to look like a small table. It's going to have a header and a body. So let's configure what will go into those parts of the table. Let's put in the city name in the header. And just to make sure they understand it's the city name, we'll add some text here that says city, and then we'll put in the city name. This is the value that's going to come out of the point. And let's put what's going to go into the body. So maybe let's pop up some population information. So there's our population. And you can add other things like a hyperlink. So this is just a regular HTML hyperlink that you could add in here. And I want to give people the ability to search for travel for this particular city. So what I'm going to do is I'll add a URL here. I have a pre-built URL, and it's just a regular URL pointing to a website. In this case, it's travel.msn.com, and it's looking at a search, and it's going to pass into that search the value of the city name. I've already included HTTP, so I'll uncheck that. So what this will do is it adds an A tag to this body of my map tips that it's just a standard HTML A tag. So it's just here's your href, and you pass in the URL, and there's the text that we'll see. And you could add whatever HTML you want to this. So if I wanted to have several links in an unordered list, I could add some UL and tags in here and configure that. So we set all of these properties in the smart tag, the layer, the header, the body. But look, if we look at the control, it's still giving us a warning. You must enter a valid value for the map property. Oh, okay. So what we need to do is we need to tie this map tips to the map so it knows what map it's working with. So when I scroll down the list here, I can choose the map that it's supposed to work with, and now the control tells me that it's happy and it's ready to be tested. So if we look at this application, we zoom in here a little bit, we should see something a little bit different, and that is our largest cities will now have this new symbol over them. And as I hover over those cities, I'll get a pop-up. In this case, the city is Rome, and there's some population information. I can click on this travel link that pops up a new web page and searches the MSN travel site for travel information on Rome. So I get some Rome vacations, some travel articles, different information like that from MSN. We could have linked to any website here. We're just using this as an example of one place where you might link to in your map tips. So that's how you set up map tips in your web application. Now let me show you a task. So here, first thing we do is we find our task manager control. Let's come over here to our toolbox and look at the different controls that we have available to us. Here's all the ArcGIS server controls. Let's add a query attributes task to our task results. So this is a lot like adding in a resource. The first thing we do is specify where the results of our task will be displayed. We have one control in our map, so that's pretty easy. And then we specify a query. So this is the query that we're going to do on this particular resource. So we specify a resource manager, a resource item. We specify the layer that we're going to query. In this case, we want to allow people to query the country status. So in the label text here, we'll do something like status, and we'll query a field called status. Let me change this to country status. And then by default, when we set this up, it's just making a simple expression, status equals some value. And by default, the user would have to type in the value that they would like to query on for the status field. Now, they might not know what that status value is. So what I've done here is decided to show a pick list. This will display a drop-down list with the appropriate unique values for that particular field. So now our users will be able to pick one of these out of the list. And I could customize this list if I want. So I'll click OK to that. Okay, I've added my query. I'll click OK to that. One more thing that I want to do is I've set up my task results in the query. Let's set up the title property for this. So this is the title that will be displayed in the application. Query country status. Okay, so now I've configured the properties on the smart tag. I configured some of the additional properties in the properties window there. Let's run this application and see how that task works. So you see now I have this tasks control that's showing me query country status, and I can query something like UN member state, find that, and it's passing this query onto this server. The server is building result set, and when it completes figuring out what all the UN member states are, it'll pass back those results to this application, specifically to this results control in the application. You can see we have 50 member states here, and let's look at Brazil. Now, one other thing that I wanted to show you here is with this control, you automatically get a context menu. So I can right-click on that feature and zoom into it. Notice how this is all Ajax enabled. The rest of my page didn't refresh when I zoomed into Brazil, just Brazil. And again, I could look at my map tips and get some travel information for Brazil if I wanted. Okay, so that's the demonstration for working with controls in the Web ADF. So let's review what we talked about. The Web ADF contains a variety of controls that you can work with. They're all built on these Ajax capabilities of ASP.NET 2.0, and that provides a very smooth user experience. You tie these different controls together through properties so that they can interact with each other, and the tasks that you build work asynchronously with the server and display results in a task results control. With that, I'll pass it back over to Brian, who looks like he has quite a few questions to answer here. So go ahead, Brian.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, we do have a lot of questions. That's great. Thanks for sending those in. Let's look at a couple here. First one, Jason from Bend asks a question that several other people are asking. Does the Web ADF come with ArcGIS server? Yes, indeed it does. In fact, it's quite easy to install both because they come on the same CD. When you get your install CDs, you'll find that when you do the install, the ADF, that is the software developer kit, or the runtime, is available right from the same disk. The SDK you can install with the server. You'll see it on the install menu as an option. So you don't have to do a separate install for the SDK. There is the runtime ADF that's actually just a separate install, but it's also on the same CD. And that's all included with the ArcGIS server, and you can install that. One tip, that is to make sure that you have Visual Studio installed before you install the SDK. That way the tools and templates that Tom has been showing you will be integrated into the Visual Studio right away. Second question, Oleg from Orlando is asking, for the Web ADF ArcGIS API, is there a control that asynchronously extends ArcXML and receives the response from the ArcGIS server? This actually brings just a general point about the Web ADF, which is that it actually does work asynchronously with the map resources. So whether it's ArcGIS or ArcGIS server or other resource, it actually sends those requests asynchronously. That is, it will send the request and the user can be interacting with the website without having to wait for that to come back. You saw that with Tom's demonstration when he was zooming and panning the map. The tiles in the map were retrieved independently of each other, and so you can actually be getting several things at once there. Another question, John from Las Lunas asks, can we add our own help content for controls specific to controls or functions? Yes, that is the help system that comes with the template, the web application, the web mapping application template has that help content, and that's just plain HTML that you can customize for your particular users. You can subtract anything that's not relevant for your application or add additional pages or content, and that's just plain HTML there, and so it's pretty easy to customize for your users. And just in general, the Web ADF template is pretty standard .NET, ASP.NET controls and code, so you can go ahead and customize that and have it conform to your look and feel, or integrate that with your own website. Maybe one more here. Jaijun from Sandy asks, is there a way we could develop a context menu for the map? That is, when the user right-clicks on the map, a menu with a list of tasks shows up, and the user can select one from the list, which invokes a callback or postback to the server. That's actually an excellent question. That's not something that's there right now. We did see something like that when Tom did the context menu for the task results control, where you're able to zoom or remove a task result from the list. That's something I'll put on our list of things to consider for a future release. But that's a really good idea, and it's maybe something we can add as we go along. Probably time to get back to the presentation. So Tom, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Brian. All right, now we're going to talk about a specific use case of building a custom tool. So we'll be adding a tool to our toolbar, and in the example that I'll show you at the end of this, we'll be adding a hyperlink tool to the toolbar. In this section, we're going to be working a little bit more with code. So we're going to move away from working with the web controls and the template, and this part's a little bit more involved, and we'll actually look at some code that works in the Common API. So when you're working in the Common API, you're working with resources, and resources provide these generic interface to these different functionalities like mapping, geocoding, and geoprocessing. In this example, we're working in the Common API, and we may have two resources, resource 1 and 2. We may work with the ArcGIS resource interface for these different resources. These resources contain differing levels of functionality, like resource 1 has mapping and geoprocessing, where resource 2 has mapping and geocoding. When I'm working in the Common API, I could just work with these and use the classes to interact with these. For example, I might be using the ArcGIS functionality with those. And really, that's all I need to worry about. Now, behind the scenes, I actually have a data source that's providing the service for those resources. When I'm working in the Common API, it doesn't really matter, but I just work with resources and functionalities. But behind the scenes, these different data sources are providing the implementation. If I want to get down a little deeper into the APIs, I can, of course, go down here and work in these specific APIs, but I don't need to, and I won't in this particular example. I can work completely in the Common API. So we'll be adding a tool to this toolbar control, and toolbar controls contain toolbar items, and they're tools. Those are things that interact with the map. commands. Those are things that you press and they do some action like full extent. You can have a drop-down box, so that would be, I don't have an example of one here, but for example, let's say you wanted to have the ability to zoom into a country and you want to have the country names listed. You could put that into your toolbar. And then we have spaces and separators for organizing your toolbar items. When you're configuring your control in Visual Studio, you'll open up the properties for your toolbar. It looks like this. We have different toolbar items, and you'll have the properties for those toolbar items over here that you can configure. Much the way the rest of the classes or the rest of the controls work in the Web ADF, these all use AJAX callbacks by default, so it's all asynchronously working with the server. You can change that to postbacks, but for most examples, a better user experience is found using these AJAX callbacks. One of the most important things that you'll set up for your tools are the tool actions. You specify a client action and a server action. The first is the client action, and this is what the user will do on the web page. For example, make a point or a line or polygon. These are JavaScript functions that you can write that define how the user will interact with your map. Now, if you're like me, you may not be all that familiar with JavaScript, and this may be somewhat daunting. The good news is the Web ADF contains a great many of pre-built JavaScript that do the most common functions, like click a point or draw a line or draw a polygon. So you specify that in the client action, but of course you could write your own JavaScript if you like. Then you specify a server action. Now this is a class that sits on the server that will listen for events that come from the tool, and the tool will pass in it the results of the client action. That class needs to implement an appropriate interface for the control that it's working with. In this case, we're interacting with the map, so we implement iMapServer tool action. If we work with a page layout, we'd implement iPageServer tool action. And there's not much to these different interfaces. They really just have one method, and we see the object model diagram for this interface down here. It's called server action, and we get one argument as type tool event args to that method. Now, tool event args is the value that's passed from the client down to the server. So when you're building this implementation, you'll work with the tool event args in your implementation of this method. There's two main things that this gives you. The first is it tells you what map control. So it has a control property on that tool event args argument, and that control is the map that you are interacting with. The second thing that you can do with tool event args is cast it to an appropriate geometry type for what client action took place. For example, if the client action was to click a point, you could cast tool event args to point event args. So we're casting this object to a new type, in this case, point event args. And you can see the code for this right here. We declare a variable as point event args and set it to the args variable, casting it to point event args. This is VB.NET code. And the same thing is true depending on the different client actions that you set up. So if you have the user define a rectangle, that casts a rectangle event args, and so on. Now, like I said throughout this presentation, the Web ADF controls use this AJAX functionality of ASP.NET 2.0. The AJAX functionality in .NET is implemented through callbacks. So callbacks are the mechanism that .NET uses to implement AJAX. Now, you could configure your own callback architecture. You have to implement some interfaces on the server. You have to write some JavaScript that goes into the client. So it's a somewhat involved process of building the plumbing for the communication between the client and the server and updating the appropriate part of the page. The good news is the Web ADF has built that plumbing for you. In most cases, all you need to do is plug into the existing architecture that the Web ADF is using for making callbacks and sending the results to the client. The Web ADF does this on each control using a callback results collection. So all you have to do is add to that callback results collection, and the Web ADF will take care of the rest. It will send the appropriate response to the client and execute whatever you're trying to do. There's several different things that you can do out of the box. You can change HTML elements. You can send images back to the client. Or in the example that we'll show, you can send JavaScript back to the client. And here's an example of how you might do that. So in this tool, we're just popping up an alert that says hello. This is a JavaScript function. We configure that string. Okay, we write some JavaScript. We create a new callback result object. We tell it that it's JavaScript, and we pass it that string. Then all we do is we add it to the callback results collection of the map. We're done. The Web ADF takes care of the process of processing those callbacks and sending the results to the client and executing the JavaScript or whatever other elements that we want to manipulate. Let me show you a quick example of that, of using we're going to create a hyperlink tool. So let's go back over here to the Solution Explorer. And I've already written this code. I'm not going to write all of this code for you. I have it out here on my file system. We have a hyperlink folder. We have a hyperlink class. Okay, there's our implementation on the server. We also have an image. So this is the image that will display for the tool in the toolbar. Okay, we've added those resources. Now let's go over to our toolbar, and we'll open up the properties for that toolbar. And we want to work with the toolbar items collection. So you can see in this toolbar items collection, I have all of my tools here. I'm going to add a new tool. I'll look at the properties for that tool, and I come in here and I set the different properties. The first I'll set up is the image that we just added to our project, the hyperlink. There it is. And I can specify other images here. I can also have some text. This is the text that we'll display, and a tooltip. Then I specify the client action. This is the JavaScript that will happen in the web browser. These are the pre-built functions that come with the Web ADF. And I'll specify a server action. Now we have to specify an assembly. In this case, I put it in the app code folder. And I named that class hyperlink. Okay, so we're done. There's our new tool on the toolbar. And let me just show you that code real quick. Now there's quite a bit of code here, but I'll just go through it quickly, hitting the high points. Well, actually, it doesn't look like there's a whole lot of code. It's pretty simple. All the code is in this iMap server tool action implementation. This is the implementation of that interface. The main points are here. I can get the map from the tool event args. I can cast that to point event args. That gives me my point to do the query. And in here, we're doing all of our common API programming. So we're getting a resource. We're building a filter. We're querying the layer. Here's the query here. And then the last thing we do is we send the result back to the client. And in this case, we create some JavaScript. And this JavaScript is just a window.open, and we're passing it a URL. We're passing it a URL with our FIPS code that we're getting from the server. Then we create a new callback result object, telling it it's JavaScript. We pass in that JavaScript, and we add it to the callback results for the map. We're done. When we run the application, the map control will take care of passing that JavaScript back to the client and executing it in our web browser. So here I'll open up my application again. I have my hyperlink tool. We click on a country here. And this hyperlink pops up information from the CIA Factbook, and I can get more information from this other web page about Italy. Okay. So we saw in this section how the toolbars contain toolbar items. You can create tools that have a client and server-side action, something that happens in the web browser and something that happens on the server. And you can tap into this callback results collection to take care of that ArcGIS or that AJAX implementation. With that, I'll turn it over to Brian to answer a few more of your questions.
Thanks, Tom. Got a lot of questions here. I'll try to answer a few more before we have to leave. Ashish from Dubai asks, what is a scenario when we will use postback instead of AJAX? And really, these days, I would probably recommend, if you, at all possible, just go ahead and use AJAX callbacks for your applications. It creates a much smoother user experience. There really aren't very many scenarios at all that I can think of, none offhand actually that I can think of, where you would probably want to use a full page postback. Possibly could be some, but can't think of any offhand. Benjamin from Mount Laurel asks, can a resource be created dynamically and added to the application? The answer is yes, actually. You can, on the fly, add a resource that is a map service or a geocoding service or something like that to your application and call that and use that in your application on the fly. There's more documentation about that in the SDK documentation. Tom will talk a bit about that, including the online resources in a bit. Another question, Jeff from Phoenix asks, we have a Linux web server with an Windows XP clients. The ArcGIS server is Unix. Will ArcGIS server work in that configuration? I think the idea there is that, yes, you can actually use servers serving services on other types of servers. So let's say your Linux server is serving an ArcGIS service or an ArcGIS service. You can actually load that into your Web ADF application, even though it's a .NET application. Those are really probably going to just be communicating over a web service. So an ArcGIS web service, an ArcGIS server internet service. And you can use those in your .NET service. And it should just, that should work. Shouldn't be any problem with doing that. Mateo from Davis asks, are the web apps compatible with Firefox and other browsers besides the Internet Explorer? Absolutely. We support Firefox, Internet Explorer, and a couple of other web browsers. If you look on our system requirements page, supported systems, you'll see that there are several web browsers that are fully supported by our Web ADF. Now, of course, you have to be a little bit careful in terms of the customizations you make because you could do some things that could break that. But out of the box, our applications are fully supported with Firefox. Maybe one or two more. Mo from Freeburg asks, can spatial analysis functions such as intersect be implemented in web applications? Absolutely. We support, with ArcGIS Server, a full set of geoprocessing functions. A couple of ways you can do that. One is to build a geoprocessing task, or to use a geoprocessing task that uses the geoprocessing service. So you can build a geoprocessing service with something like a toolbox or a model in ArcGIS, and you can deploy that as a geoprocessing service to ArcGIS Server. Then you can integrate that into your web application through a geoprocessing task. You could also do that on a custom basis, so you could go in through code and call that geoprocessing service, or actually call ArcObjects directly and use the code directly without having to pre-create a model or a toolbox. Robert from Albuquerque asks, is there a task to communicate with SQL Server directly rather than ArcSTE? I think what you're asking there, of course, you can communicate with a database directly in ASP.NET to integrate and do database queries. I think what you may be asking there is, excuse me, if you have, let's say, an XY column there and you want to add, let's say, points on the fly to your application, a couple of ways to do that. One would be to use what we could call an event layer in the ArcMap document, and you can add that, and then that will be integrated into your map through a point layer. You could also use the graphics layer in the Web ADF. The graphics layer is a separate kind of functionality in your Web ADF, your map control, and your resource manager control that you can use to add graphics onto your map. And so in code, you could go out to the database, grab that information from the database using standard .NET query methods, and then add those onto the map through a graphics layer. I think we're about out of time, so Tom's going to wrap up with a few more concluding comments, and thanks very much for your questions.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, before we go, I would like to point you to a few additional resources. First of all, we have some virtual campus courses, Introduction to ArcGIS for Developers and Migrating to VB.net. We have some instructor-led training that's coming out, developing applications with ArcGIS Server using the Microsoft .NET framework. Also, we have extending ArcGIS desktop applications. This would get you more into the ArcObjects programming that you might do behind the scenes in one of these web services. And we have the developer help at edn.esri.com. This is a very useful resource and is being updated by our developers here at ESRI really on a daily basis. There's a great deal more information here than you might find in the developer help that comes installed with ArcGIS Server. So if you want more information and you may not have everything in your current help, look at edn.esri.com. Your comments help us improve our seminars. Please take a moment to complete our survey. Just click the Give Us Feedback link to take the survey. We hope you enjoyed today's seminar. On behalf of ESRI, I'd like to thank you all for attending.